We're gonna we're gonna we're gonna
Oh
start
my
because
God,
it's
it's 11:01.
1 minute past
Oh, Lord. Okay. I'm
already.
handing everything over to you, Pilar.
I sorry, my voice is a little. I have a little laryngitis. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening in my case. Welcome to today's American Community Media News Briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor with ACOM, and I'll be your moderator for today. And we are going to be looking at diaspora politics in a deeply polarized moment where communities are not only responding to events in their home countries, but also shaping political debates in the United States. Diasporas are often described as voting blocs or communities, but they are also political actors with influence, internal divisions, and sometimes contradictions. And of course, as always, we invite reporters to post their questions in the chat. We will take questions from reporters immediately after each speaker presents, and we will send video and follow-up material after today's briefing. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our simultaneous interpreters in Korean, Mandarin, and Spanish. Later today, again, as I said, we'll send video and any collateral. So let me introduce you to our distinguished panel. Helen Zia is a journalist, author of Asian American Dreams, and a leading voice on Asian American civil rights and political movements. Eduardo Gamarra, professor of politics and international relations at Florida International University and an expert on Latin American politics and diaspora engagement. William Beeman, professor of anthropology at the University of Minnesota and a specialist on Iran, Middle Eastern societies, and diaspora dynamics. Thank you all for being here. And with that, we're going to start with Professor Gamarra. And let's begin with him to ground us in the Latin American context. Professor Gamarra, you've studied Venezuelan and Cuban diasporas closely. Sorry, I'm a little sick. How are these communities evolving as political actors in the United States today?
Yeah, that's a very broad question, and so I'll try to be succinct in my answers. And I hope you feel better because it sounds like it's a tough cough. So, um, well, when you look at the Cuban population in particular, um, this is a population, as most of you know, which arrived following the Cuban Revolution and really didn't become significant in terms of American politics until the mid 1980s, when basically this population began to nationalize, they became U.S. citizens. And the Republican Party did a very good job of pushing their agenda on that specific group in the 1980s. And one of the things that characterizes the Cubans in particular is their rejection of the Democratic Party stems back to the idea that John Kennedy did not provide air support in the context of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Uh, so the Republicans were able to capitalize on that in voter registration drives and massive drives to achieve U.S. citizenship. So there's kind of this original 1980s thrust under President Reagan. That continued, that growth of the connections between Republicans and the Democrats really continued for the better part of the next 40 years, with some interruptions. And most people who study immigrants uh, argue that, of course, with time, and this was our hypothesis, right? With time, uh, and especially second and third generations, Cuban Americans would gravitate naturally toward the Democratic Party, particularly on social issues, right? And so what we found is really something quite interesting among Cuban Americans, that on social issues, they have indeed gravitated toward let's call them more progressive issues. defense of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. In fact, some of the zip codes in Hialeah, for example, are the highest per capita consumption of Obamacare in the country. Yet those same zip codes are zip codes where 70% plus of Cuban Americans there voted for Donald Trump. So you have this incredible contradiction, and also, for example, on immigration policy, where historically, of course, Cubans have been the great beneficiaries of American immigration policy. Um, from the 1960s onward, right, the Cuban Adjustment Act has been particularly important in terms of separating Cuban immigrants from the lot of immigrants, but specifically from the lot of Latin American immigrants, in the sense that uh, Cubans 1 year and 1 day following their arrival in the United States are immediately eligible for U.S. residence, right? Now, that goes back 50 years to the mid 1960s, and it has been adjusted in some measure. But um, but what's fascinating about this is that Cuban Americans are the large beneficiaries of very, very expansive immigration policy. Yet today, what we're seeing is the alignment of Cuban Americans with very restrictive immigration policies. And it's not surprising, for example, that also in Hialeah, during the 19, pardon me, during the 2024 campaign, President Trump uh, announced uh, his massive. Pardon me, I sort of disappeared there from. Am I still there? Hello.
Your camera seems to be off. I don't know what happened. You can keep talking.
Okay,
Oh,
but
there you are. Okay.
sorry. Um, but during the campaign in 2024, Donald Trump announced the mass deportation of Hispanics, right? He argued the criminals and he argued those who were here illegally, as he likes to call them. And this was done in front of a predominantly Cuban American audience, but there were also Venezuelans and Colombians and so on. So these two positions are very interesting to observe, right? How the great beneficiaries of expansive, progressive American policies also are the ones who appear to be today most identified with the Republican Party and with Donald Trump. Now, there are some nuances to that, and since I don't want to monopolize the time, but just to be very quick about it,
Yeah, and I
right?
want to ask you a follow-up when you
Right.
can.
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, that there are specific nuances, right? So for example, right, in the context of the big beautiful bill and the restrictions on Medicare and Medicaid and the reduction of benefits, right, we're now beginning to see some of the misgivings by those who voted for Donald Trump on social policy. And then when it comes to immigration policy, we're also seeing something quite remarkable, that the administration has reversed course, not on the Cuban Adjustment Act writ large, but on specific dimensions. For example, the wet foot, dry foot policy that President Obama, in fact, ended in 2017 before he left office, but also in terms of now very specifically the deportation of those who have arrived in the last 5 years, which have been almost a million new Cuban migrants. And so, in that context, what you have, and I'll end with this, with Cubans, is you have among Cuban Americans now growing frustration with the Trump administration, right? And they're between their leadership, which is very pro-Trump, and voters who are seeing themselves affected on the social policy side with Obamacare, and on the migration side, all of a sudden they're seeing their relatives being deported not just back to Cuba, but to places like Uganda and Ecuador, which are the options that they're generally given.
Well, Professor, I can't wait to hear your take on why the administration is not why the administration, but what is the attitude and what are the splits in the diasporas in both Cubans and Venezuela with what's happening now, not just on immigration, but also on intervention in their countries. Like I'm Venezuelan, so the United States went in, took Maduro, and people were hoping we're going to get a democracy, and we're still uneasy about what's happening. And the same thing is happening now in Cuba. There's a forced negotiation going on, and people are hoping that there's going to be change. Why is this happening? And what are the reactions that you're seeing? And we only have you have to do that in like 3 or 4 minutes.
Right. Well, another one of those great questions to try to answer and explain the unexplainable, right? Um, the the Venezuelans were largely very, very inclined to the Democratic Party when they first came in. And survey after survey that we conducted, focus groups and so on, even considered Donald Trump the blonde the blonde Chavez, right? The Chavez Catire, as they used to call him, right? They identified his populist style and everything with him. And that was until about 2016. But then we saw this dramatic shift as Donald Trump promised that they would get rid of through maximum pressure, they would get rid of the socialist regime in Cuba, right? But all the while, what's been evident is from the very beginning is that there have been ongoing negotiations, especially in terms of the oil industry, and that's where the current government of Venezuela comes in. Delcy Rodriguez and her brother have been in constant contact with American oil companies, companies that largely have been in Venezuela for the bulk of the last 27 years, despite the socialist regime and despite the sanctions. But what it translates into the way we've been looking at public opinion among Venezuelans, and we regularly poll Venezuelans, and what we've seen, of course, is this support for the Democrats early, and then this real serious gravitation towards Donald Trump, based on the promises that Donald Trump would topple the regime. But you
Yeah.
also have, beginning in 2019, a mass wave of Venezuelan immigrants characterized by this administration, of course, as gangsters, whatever you want to call it. And so what you have is this interesting split in the community, much like you have a split in the Cuban community, between those who have arrived in the last 5 years, who are largely the recipients of TPS, largely the recipients of other kinds of measures, right? And those who are citizens. So you also have among Venezuelans, for example, citizens who vote for Trump, right? And who are now, especially those who have relatives on TPS and who have lost TPS, now you have this deep concern, right? So for example, among those, we asked a question last year, among those who voted for Donald Trump, how many would vote for Donald Trump again? We found that 50% would, right? 26% said they would not. But what was interesting is that 70% of those who said they would not vote for Donald Trump, these are US citizens, right? 70% of them have a relative who is either on TPS or a humanitarian parole. So this gives you a sense of how this policy has changed. And now today, of course, and I'll end with this, the great controversy has to do, well, you know, the U.S. government, Marco Rubio and President Trump promised maximum pressure, sanctions, and so on and so forth, and to do away with the communists, right? In fact, those who were Democrats were considered communists and the like. All of the negotiations between the Biden administration and the Venezuelan government were considered, the Biden administration siding with socialists and so on. And then after January 3rd, we have this very interesting political scenario here, right? Where people are very, very supportive of the removal of Nicolás Maduro, but they're extraordinarily confused about what it means to, in fact, to co-govern with the 21st century socialists, right? And to co-govern with them in a context where essentially you have the repressive apparatus is intact. In fact, yesterday They replaced 2 days ago. They replaced the Minister of Interior
That's
with a guy who is even, who is even much more important in terms of human rights violations. And the administration appears to be fine with this. So there's some confusion in terms of how things are looking here. But you still have a solid number of particularly, right, U.S. citizens who've been here for a while who are firmly in Donald Trump's camp.
well, thank you, Professor. Please stay around. We're gonna come back with more questions after we go through all the panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And as we meet on the Eve of Nowruz, an ancient celebration of the Persian New Year, which means new beginnings, we hope for the people of Iran. And let's go now to William Beeman, who will talk about the country's diaspora. He is the professor of anthropology at the University of Minnesota. Professor Beeman, how would you describe the political dynamics within the Iranian diaspora in the US right now?
In order to understand what's going on with the Iranian diaspora, we have to go back more than 40 years to the Iranian Revolution of 1978, 1979. During the revolution, there were actually three factions that hoped to replace the Shah when the Shah fell from and was exiled from Iran. The first group were secular nationalists who actually governed the country for about 6 months until the U.S. hostage crisis in the fall of 1979. The second group were the religionists that were led by Ayatollah Khomeini, and the third group were what we might call Islamic Marxists. This is a group that was inspired especially by the writings of Frantz Fanon, the socialist author who talked about the wretched of the earth and poverty. So these three groups all thought that they were going to be the rulers of Iran after the Shah left, and basically the religionists, that is Ayatollah Khomeini, on the back of the hostage crisis, was able to solidify power to establish a new Islamic constitution in Iran, and they have been in power ever since the time of the revolution. The other two groups left the country. What the principal Marxist group are the Mujahideen Khalq, who for a long time were established in Iraq and continued to be in opposition to the government. They have been ousted from Iraq as a result of the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003. They are now established in Albania, but they have representatives all throughout Europe. So they are primarily in Europe. However, this group, the Mujahideen Khalq, also have had supporters within the United States. Sam Brownback, the senator from Kansas, actually gave them a space in his senatorial office. John Bolton, the rather prominent anti-Iranian specialist, was a direct supporter of the Mujahideen Khalq, and they have received money. They received money during the first Trump administration in the order of $75 million from the U.S. government in support. The secular nationalists include royalists. These are the people who left Iran at the time of the revolution because they were allied with the Shah. And these people largely are in the United States, and they have a huge concentration of population in California. One of the important outlets for this group have been media outlets, specifically Iranian media outlets in California, who broadcast things like popular music and popular theater, which is pretty much restricted by the Islamic population in Iran. So these two groups, that is the royalist / secular nationalists and the Islamic Marxist groups, they're both firmly opposed to the current regime in Iran. And for the most part, these groups are supportive of the Republican Party and are supportive of Trump because they think that President Trump or the Republicans, depending on which regime is in power, they think that they are going to eliminate the Islamic regime in Iran. That's their principal hope, and they're championing the Republican hostilities toward the current regime in Iran because they think that they are going to be that the religious regime is going to be ousted, and they also have in the back of their minds the idea that they are going to take over, that they are going to be reinstalled, that they'll be able to go back to Iran. One of the important things that is I think important about the Iranian diaspora community is that although they may be in diaspora, they're outside of Iran. They're deeply committed to Persian culture, and their longing and homesickness for Iran and for their homeland and for Iranian culture is palpable. So they maintain Iranian cultural traditions wherever they are to a great extent. So we're having today Persian New Year, Nowruz. It will be celebrated throughout the world by Iranians, and they maintain language classes and other cultural events. There have been a number of wealthy Iranians who've established Iranian cultural foundations throughout the United States in order to preserve the culture. And almost all Iranians who are outside of the country continually have been going back to Iran for visits to visit family and friends. So they maintain close ties to their country. But the Iranians in diaspora are almost entirely deeply opposed to the current religious regime. And this is one of the reasons why they have aligned themselves with the Republican Party. There is a feeling and a rumor, I don't know how to put it, a belief on the part of many of these people that the Carter administration actually installed the religious regime in Iran. And the reason that they state that is that they believe that the Carter administration capitulated when it was clear that that Khomeini and the religionists were going to be taking over in power. That Carter actually gave up any kind of resistance to the religious regime and accommodated them. And so, therefore, the idea that somehow Democrats and Carter have been soft and on the religious regime and have actually supported it and enabled it is a very, very widespread belief in the Iranian community. And as much as people can point out that both Democrats and Republicans have been hostile to the actions of the Iranian regime, the idea that Democrats are supportive of them continues to persist in the Iranian community.
Thank you, Professor. So how are people in the diaspora feeling the current situation, the war that was launched in Iran? What are the split lines there?
Well, there is a group that that are known by in the Iranian community as Aghazadeh, and these are the essentially the children and now grandchildren of the ruling class under the Shah that came to the United States. Many of whom I want to be a little nuanced in what I'm saying, but many of them, let's say, managed to export quite a lot of wealth from Iran when they came to the United States during the revolution. They are well established in the United States. They're among the wealthiest immigrant communities in the United States. There's very, very little poverty among the Iranian American community. And they are, many of these people are hopeful that the son of the Shah, of the exiled Shah, that is Reza Pahlavi, will return and become the ruler of Iran. And they have had demonstrations all throughout the United States and all throughout Europe. And Reza, to be sure, has cultivated both the American Jewish community and also the Republican Party throughout his life. He's now, my age practically, and but he has constituents here in the United States. The only thing is that he has no support in Iran. And so the idea that he could somehow be installed as a monarchical ruler in Iran again is a little bit of a fantasy, because although he has support here and might even have support with the Trump administration, he doesn't have the support of the Iranian people in general. There are people in Iran who would support his return as a monarch, but the problem here is that not to go into too much detail, but the United States already installed his father in a CIA-led coup in 1953, and as a result, the shadow of this U.S. installation of a monarch in Iran leaves an extremely bad taste in for the Iranian community in Iran, and this is one reason why he would lack support if he were to return to Iran, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, let's take some questions for you, and then let's take some questions for Professor Gamarra, which I jumped completely. I should have taken questions for him before. Okay, Henrietta Burrows, you had a question for Professor Beeman?
Yes, I do, Pilar. Thanks so much. I have two. First, you explained that John Bolton supported the principal Marxist group, even with their opposition to the current regime. Wouldn't the Republicans later have to deal with everything Marxism represents? It seems unimaginable that Republicans would support Marxists.
Yeah, they don't care. Honestly, they don't care. What they're looking for is a group that has some kind of military operation, which the Mujahideen Khalq absolutely do, although they're all getting pretty old. But the idea, I think, that John Bolton and others who have supported the Mujahideen is that they would be the cat's paw. They would be the people who could actually go in with some kind of paramilitary group, overthrow the government, and then the United States would deal with them because they're relatively small. I mean, I think that it hasn't been well thought out by the Republican supporters for this group. But the idea that they have some kind of military operation and some kind of military training is, I guess, the attraction that this group has for people like John Bolton. He hasn't been quizzed about this, by the way, recently. I would be very, very happy to see someone press him on his former support for this group. And also, people like, I think Sam Brownback may have died actually, but Ileana, oh golly, what's her name? Professor Gamarra can remember. Ileana Leighton.
Ileana Ross Leighton.
Yeah, Ileana Ross Leighton. Right. She also was a great supporter of the Mujahideen Khalq and gave them, funneled money to them and gave them office space in Washington. She's now out of office, but these are the kinds of people who thought that the Mujahideen would be a viable way of getting rid of the Islamic regime.
Thank you, Professor.
I don't know. Pilar, could I ask the second question?
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
Now, as to Carter's alleged capitulation to the Iranian regime, wouldn't it be understood since the regime was holding American hostages?
Yeah, actually, the 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 fantasy. I don't know how to call this. What to call this? The belief on the part of the Iranian community is a kind of a post facto belief. That is, once it was all over, the Iranian community in the United States began to rationalize what actually happened during this very, very tumultuous period. They looked back and they said, well, there was an American general who, and I'm sorry, I'm just blanking, who actually was sent to Iran by Carter, and supposedly he told the Iranian armed forces to essentially stand down and to not launch a revolution against the Islamic regime. And this one event has been seized upon by the Iranian community as proof positive that the United States wanted to establish the Islamic regime. And the story as it goes on is that the United States was trying to establish a so-called green belt of Islamic resistance to communism at the time. Now, you remember we were in the Cold War. And so the idea that somehow Islamic rule in the Middle East would prevent communist incursion into the Middle East was a very, very strong belief. And there is some truth to it. That Carter established a military force that was supposed to prevent a land invasion of Iran by the Soviet Union. This paramilitary force, or this small military force, eventually expanded and became the U.S. Central Command. So this very small action on the part of Carter then expanded, and the U.S. Central Command now includes all of Central Asia and all the way down to Ethiopia. It's a kind of mission creep. And so you can see how people might get the idea that the Carter administration was in fact supportive of Khomeini. It kind of defies belief in the part of the United States. When I tell people this, they are astonished that anyone could possibly believe this, but it is a widespread belief in the Iranian community.
Wow. Okay, let's go back and take a couple questions from Professor Gamarra before we move on. Pamela and Chang, you have a couple questions in the chat, but I'm interested in your question about race and lived experience with the Cuban community. Can you ask it, Pamela?
Yes, I think this question now would really apply to many of the diaspora groups. But my question specifically was, sometimes when you look at the divides in terms of how people vote, how the diaspora votes, I'm curious, especially in the case of Cubans, because there are anecdotes that state that based on race, Cubans vote differently. And I'm wondering if that is something that is seen across most diaspora communities, that the most of those that are white would favor the Republicans and the blacks would favor the Democratic Party. But I'm just curious what any of the panelists' take is on that. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Gamarra.
Yeah, let me address that very quickly. It's not a coincidence that when you look at the different waves of migrants, especially the Cuban wave, that the earlier migrants would be lighter skinned than the migrants who came in later. In fact, I had the privilege of working with the Mariel Exodus in 1980 in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. And that was really the first time that we began to see Afro descendants coming in as part of the Cuban diaspora. And that was an incredible, how should I put it, moment, because as, for example, we tried to relocate, I was working for the Red Cross at the time, some of these refugees back into Miami. Cuba is a society that has really been mixed race, right? But whitening, of course, is part of all of the Latin American experience, right? And so, so for example, I had one case of a relatively dark man who came in and had his little crumbled up piece of paper after crossing the ocean, right? And with an address here in Coral Gables in Florida and in Miami, which is a wealthy neighborhood in Miami. And I called the brother and I said, I have your brother here, and you know, he wants to know if you will sponsor him. And the brother in Miami asked me if he was standing next to me, and I said yes. And he said, would you please tell him that you haven't found me? And I said, why? This is a very unusual thing. And he said, well, because I live in Coral Gables, and in Coral Gables, blacks aren't welcomed, right? Even though, I mean, this is long after the civil rights struggles, right? At least a couple of years, at least. And but that is sort of the prevalent dimension of racial politics in Florida, right, among Cuban Americans. And it's also prevalent among Venezuelans as well, right? But I think the more visible dimension is the one where it's basically those who have just arrived are the ones that are seen, and they'll say, you know, in focus groups, we've heard people tell us they're not people like us, right? No son gente como uno, right? And
Mhm.
so, you know, those of us who came early, we are people, right? We're decent people. Those people who are coming in are not. And there's a racial connotation to that, right? But more than
Mhm.
anything else, they'll express it as a class differentiation, right? So hope that answers you.
Yes, and you can go back in the immigration history of the United States and find that all over the place. Thank you, Professor. I'm going to go ahead and go with our third panelist, Helen Zia, journalist, author, civil rights. And Helen, in terms of the context, we were thinking about, you know, the Chinese American Summit that it's upcoming, but you want to address the larger Asian American community, so that is so broad and diverse. Please give us your thoughts on how those diaspora groups are faring under the current world that we have.
Well, thank you, Pilar, and thank you, ACOM, for this really important and enlightening conversation. I know time is short, and I've been listening to Eduardo and Bill and just, you know, thinking like, where are the threads? It's really amazing to see different diasporic groups and how they've been affected at different times of US foreign policy and so forth. And I was thinking about all of the hundreds of thousands of Chinese and Indian immigrants, indentured workers who were in Cuba in the 1800s, and many of whom ended up in the US as a secondary or tertiary migration. And with the current invasions in the Middle East, that it is largely Asian migrants who are there, who are taking the brunt of the killings of civilians as well. So when we speak of diasporas, I think it's, you know, diasporas in relationship to foreign policy and so forth, that the experience of Asians in America, which we would be looking back 150 to 200 years, so different generations of migrations of different Asian nationalities and ethnicities today. The overall lesson is really how the diasporic community can become pawns of and used in a larger scheme of you know, international interventions. For Asians in America, that really began as part of the imperialistic and colonial efforts of Western nations like the US, Britain, France, Spain, you know, et cetera, that really plundered Asia and destroyed the local economies there. And so then the workforces became labor and expendable labor throughout South America, the Caribbean, and the US, North America. And so what lessons can we learn from how those diasporic Asian communities were treated? You asked what roles they might have played in politics at the time. Well, unlike the Cuban migrants or the more recent migrants who were given TPS treatment and fast-tracked through the U.S. immigration system, the Chinese and Asian diaspora were the first to be excluded, and were the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Page Act in the 1870s. These prevented Chinese and then later all Asian migrants from becoming citizens and political participants in the U.S. system. So, for example, they couldn't even testify in court if their family member was murdered and they witnessed it. An Asian person could not testify, they could not vote, they could not run for office, if they could not buy property. So they were an entirely disenfranchised diaspora community. And when we look today at the political, I would say, involvement or maturity of Asian American communities, the citizen generations, they only became, the exclusion era only ended in 1952. So we were talking about 75 years of the ability to participate in the U.S. as opposed to other diasporic communities in America that have had hundreds of years. And, of course, the U.S. is a diasporic nation, except for indigenous people and enslaved people from Africa. The rest came here, whether as refugees or economic refugees or whatever. So the experience of the different Asian diaspora communities, first, if you look more or less generally chronologically, in larger numbers, we're talking, well, first the Filipinos were here in the 1600s, but in larger numbers, the Chinese migration, the Japanese migration, then the Filipino, Indian migrations, and each one had to fight in court. And even though they could not vote, they found proxies, they found allies, white legal allies to represent them in court. And so there were nearly 100 Chinese American Supreme Court cases that in the 1800s, and one of them led to birthright citizenship in 1898, where the US Supreme Court then said that, this Chinese American who was born in the US, he is entitled to be an American citizen by virtue of his birth. And that reestablished the 14th Amendment and the earlier, legal constitutional things to say, yes, birthright citizenship. And of course, now we see that under attack. And it's not just going forward for future people who might be here and born to undocumented parents. It is also going backwards. There is no backward limitation to that. And I say to all of you journalists on this, that this will devastate our communities. My parents were refugees from China, and they overstayed their visas. The China they left didn't exist anymore when they left in the 1940s and 50s. And so this birthright citizenship upheaval and executive order could go back and denaturalize people like me. And so, so these are things that were fought for hard in the 1800s, but we've seen over and over again. And I just want to reemphasize the use of diasporic communities as pawns. I mean, we see over and over again that when US-Asia, US-China policy develops a sniffle or a cold, Asian American communities get pneumonia. And, whether that's with the COVID, period of the rise of thousands of hate incidents directed toward anybody who looked Chinese. So that's why I don't just talk about Chinese in America. Asians are pretty much lumped together, and that includes South Asians as well, because, the implication of being terrorists or Muslims, following 9/11. So whether you're a brown or yellow Asian American, there's the targeting depending on what the current use of pitting people against each other. And so I guess I want to just say that from the outset, that we've seen that the China initiative, the implication that every high school student who might have been born in China is potentially a spy for the People's Republic of China. There have been periods of time under the Clinton administration when it was, if you had an Asian name, no matter where in Asia you were from, you were thought to be a conduit to the People's Republic of China, no matter how many generations in the US. So there's that threat of communism that both Eduardo and Bill have talked about, but in this current environment, China is the existential threat to America, and not so much because it's communist, just because it's, you know, all of the terrible things that are attributed to China, and because unfortunately the drumbeat of popular opinion and controlling the media has its impact on the general population. I mean, Hitler's regime really demonstrated that very well. It doesn't matter whether something is true or false. If you repeat it long enough, you can get people to believe you. And I think we see that over and over again today. And so I and the work I do in the Vincent Chin Institute, and Vincent Chin was a young man who was beaten to death with a baseball bat during the anti-Japan period of the 1980s, that we know China is the meme. It is viewed as the existential threat to America. And for the majority of Americans who can't even find China on a map, if you ask them, what is the enemy of America, they will say China. And so Asian Americans are very aware that whatever hiccup comes up, and to be used as a pawn, as a distraction, to be used as a divisive element, to have people fight against each other, or to create an enemy, where an enemy is not an imminent threat to American national security, and then to have an invasion and inspire further, violence, which we are seeing within domestic U.S. as well. This is a pattern. This is a pattern that has gone on since the creation of this country, and we are seeing it. Asian Americans have felt it ever since, the earliest days in the North American continent, and we see it played out every day. So the violence that's going on, whether it's in Iran or Venezuela or starving Cubans to death, this has a spillover to every community, and it's going to be used to divide us and to pit us against each other, and also to incite violence among those who are susceptible to take a perceived enemy and think it's their neighbor. Pilar, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Helen. I'm interested in having both Bill and Eduardo respond to your idea that diasporas can become pawns of government and administrations, because I don't know about the Iranian one, but I know that among Venezuelans and Cubans, and I'm Venezuelan, there's this feeling among some of us that's what's been happening. I don't know what you think, Eduardo.
Well, I think the answer is yes, but it's obviously something that has been handled shrewdly by. And by the way, this isn't something where the Democrats are better than the Republicans or anything. It's been done time and time again. And in fact, in part of our work on U.S. foreign policy, right, one of the things that we keep getting in numerous countries is the idea that the worst ally of all is the United States, because you can't trust them uh, to keep a promise for the long term, right? And so right now, a lot of this is going on in the discussion, for example, over over the co-governance in Venezuela, right? In some sectors, right? In fact, as I said earlier, we are in essence co-governing and supporting the repressive structure that has remained behind, right? With over 500 political prisoners. And so perhaps there's a debate also, and perhaps most illustrated by Maria Corina Machado, right, the Nobel Prize winner, who everybody assumed, right, was the legitimate leader of the opposition and who would be supported by the Americans and so on. Now, there was a calculation there, and it's American interest, right, above loyalty, certainly. And and she's fallen into line clearly, right? But I think when you talk to some of her supporters, in fact, we had her spokesperson, David Smolansky, present a report 2 days ago at our university, in which he basically documents that, over the last 27 years, the Venezuelans spent $63.8 billion. They paid the Cubans, and the Cubans used that to build up the repressive architecture in Cuba, in Venezuela, right? Well, the reality is that architecture of repression remains in place. And so many people, many Venezuelans are saying, well, wait a minute, right? How is it that the U.S. is fine co-governing for the mid to long term with that kind of a repressive structure that the Cubans designed? And then if you add to that the discussions that are going on right now about the Cuban scenario, which is the Venezuelan scenario, right? And by the way, they also have pushed this in the sense that there'll be a Delcy kind of scenario in Iran, right? Which shows a little bit of how little they understand about beyond. Certainly, they don't understand much about Iran, but I'll let the professor respond. But my sense right now is that again, among certain groups, there's this sense that, well, we spent 67 years of sanctions on Cuba. And now, essentially, in terms of American calculations, we're okay with the president resigning and co-governing with the remaining structure of the regime, right? So, so in that sense, diaspora communities are instrumental, absolutely instrumental in either achieving foreign policy objectives or even domestic policy objectives, right? So for many, many years, the Cuban American population in Florida was largely used to win elections in a swing state. So a very, very small number of votes in Florida could determine the outcome of the presidential election. And so Cuban Americans became a very, very significant community in that sense. So we'll see how this plays out in November, though. So.
Thank you. Professor Beeman, do you have any comments about this idea of diasporas becoming pawns?
You're muted.
Yeah, you are muted. Let's see.
Dr. Beeman, you're muted.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's under Pilar's control. I can't unmute
Ah,
myself.
okay.
No, it wasn't. No.
Okay. In any case, the Iranian community is very different from the Latin American community and to a certain extent from the Chinese community in that they are extremely wealthy by comparison. There are, of course, Iranians that have lower incomes, but they're extremely wealthy in general as a community and extremely well educated. Before the Iranian Revolution, they were the second largest population of international students in American universities. Ironically, many of the Iranian nuclear scientists currently resident in Iran were trained in the United States. They were trained at MIT and other places. So the contributions of the Iranian community to political life have been very, very largely financial. And we don't know the extent to which the Iranian wealthy Iranians have contributed to political campaigns. Because no one is really keeping track of this in the same way that they're keeping track of, for instance, the Cuban population in Florida. They're not large enough as a community to be able to actually swing elections. And although they had an influence in Orange County in California for a long time, that was practically the only place where there was enough of a concentration of Iranians to really make a difference in elections. And of course, California is a majority Democratic state now, and so the influence that the Iranian community can have is really dispersed and indirect. Nevertheless, the Iranian broadcast community in Southern California is still an amazingly influential and important force in concretizing Iranian opinion. And as I say, there are many Iranian billionaires in the United States. They're kind of hidden, but I know absolutely that they are contributing to political campaigns and largely to Republican political campaigns. And they have been, they have been appealed to by the Republican Party, and that has been an amazingly important source of influence.
Thank you, Helen. As a journalist, as a writer, as a leader, what would you recommend us in the community and ethnic media to be able to cover these diasporas effectively? What's your recommendation?
Well, one thing is listening to all of the comments. I think it's important to remember that none of these communities are monolithic. And I'm speaking about my own comments about Asian Americans. I mean, I'm generalizing, but and Asian Americans, include people from countries all from, the Pacific to West Asia, and so the culturally, generationally, what cohort of when the immigrations took place, whether they were migrations from as economic migrants or from war or persecution. I mean, each one has its own story. And there are very wealthy Asian Americans, a lot from the, I would say, Chinese, the more established Chinese and Indian communities. And you can see certainly by the number of appointees from the Indian American community in recent, federal administrations that there's influence there. However, I would say not to view any of these communities as monolithic, because sometimes the repression and the being used as pawns backfires, and there's really a different reaction. So for Japanese Americans during World War II, Rachel Maddow has done an incredible podcast called Burn Order, where FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, and his, henchmen all knew that Japanese Americans were not a national security threat, yet they incarcerated 124,000 and even kidnapped people from Peru, Japanese Peruvians to the US, and who are still in a sort of a twilight zone state because they had no documentation. They were kidnapped by the US government. And what has happened now, 2 or 3 generations later? Their children and grandchildren are staunch, I won't say Democrats or Republicans, I will say progressively standing against, this kind of human rights violation, whether it's in the US or the world or nuclear arms, and very active, opposing ICE, opposing the incarceration of immigrants, newer immigrants today, accused people who are by their appearance or their name might be, quote, undocumented, and have been fighting against having former incarceration camps that were used to hold their parents and grandparents that are now actually proposed to hold today's current immigrants. And so I guess I would say to our journalists, dig and don't see our communities as monolithic. There are general things to say about them, but there are also specific stories that can really uplift our communities too, and show how people are resisting and how they have for as long as they've been here. Pilar, you're muted.
Okay, so sorry about that. We reached the end. The time is up. So thank you, Helen, Zia, Eduardo Gamarra, William Beeman. This has been so enlightening and so informative. We appreciate you being with us, and I appreciate all of my colleagues' questions.